Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope everybody's well and I hope you haven't burned any PCBs, any fingers, anything in between. Hope you're all good. Today's video is going to be about whoopsies, and it's basically mistakes that beginners tend to make when starting out soldering, which is fine. This is exactly how we learn. We make mistakes. But I'm here today to go through 10 common mistakes beginners tend to make when starting off soldering. And I'm gonna go through each and every one of them, but most importantly, I'm gonna show you how to fix them or to avoid them. So without further ado, let's get into the video.
The first common mistake is using the wrong temperature on your soldering iron. Temperature plays a key role in soldering. If it's too low, then the solder won't flow properly, and if it's too high, you might damage components or burn the PCB. This tends to happen more often with soldering irons that don't have a temperature adjustment setting. I do not recommend to get one of those for beginners because you need control over your temperature unless you want to get frustrated. And because of this, you wonder why you can't achieve a good soldering joint, or why the soldering wick doesn't do its job, or the soldering looks like after World War II, and so on. A good rule of thumb is to keep your iron between 350 and 400 degrees Celsius or 660 and 750 Fahrenheit. For most electric work, I would say. I personally don't go over 380 degrees Celsius. I simply just don't see the need for it. Although there are some cases where I had to amp up the heat, but very rarely. I recommend that you use a temperature controlled soldering station if possible. The one I prefer and have worked with for around 5 years in electronic production is the Weller WE1010. It is, in my opinion, one of the best for beginners to start with. And if you don't prefer this one, I've heard HACO is a very loved brand by those who work with repair of electronics. Also, it's very important that the soldering iron fits well in your hand, so you can have stability and be comfortable while you're soldering. Moving on to mistake number 2, and that is using the wrong size of soldering tin. For example, say you want to solder an SMD component, but you use a soldering tin that is 0.6 millimeter in size, which unfortunately I see is being recommended for any type of component in most soldering tutorials out there. What will end up happening is you will deposit way more tin than necessary, and then you will have a blob. Nobody likes a blob. Like, look at it. No, that's caca. We don't want this. Or let's say you want to solder a through-hole component and you pick a 0.3 millimeter soldering tin. This might lead to your component not having enough tin in the solder joint, or it will take forever to finish soldering that component. Soldering tin comes in different sizes, and it does so for a reason. You will find the size usually written on the label of the roll. The size of the strand matters for the type of soldering you will be doing. For example, if you're soldering an SMD component, you should be going for a smaller diameter, like, for example, 0.3 millimeters. This gives you much more control on the amount of solder that you melt on the pad. But if you want to solder through-hole components and the size of the feet and pads are bigger, then you can very well use the 0.6 millimeter soldering tin. Another thing to be aware of is that the amount of flux inside the core of the strand will increase with the size of the soldering tin, which is why I recommend you only get the ones that have flux core. Mistake number 3 is using the wrong tip size on your soldering iron or the wrong shape. This common mistake is also related to size, but also shape, and it's about choosing the wrong solder tip for the type of component you're trying to solder. In the case of SMD components, you can very easily overheat the solder joints and the PCB, which leads to the component just flying away, or you will not be able to achieve good solder flow because the tip is way too big for the amount of tin you need, and it will burn the flux away faster, leaving you with a very unappealing looking connection. The general rule here is to pick smaller soldering tips for small areas or components, and, of course, bigger soldering tips for bigger areas or your components. Also, if you are a beginner, I recommend you start with the beveled shape. This shape offers much more stability. As you can see, it's much easier to solder properly if you select a smaller tip for SMD components and of course a bigger tip for through-hole components. And some people might say, yeah, just use flux, it fixes everything, flux is life. No. Well, in certain situations, yes, but that is not always the case, nor is it efficient, and it doesn't always guarantee that you will get the desired result, not to mention the amount of time you will spend washing the board to get rid of all that flux. I'm going to say it, and I promise I'm only saying it regarding this situation. Size does matter, but only here. We good? We good. Mistake number 4 is not using flux, or sometimes even using too much. Soldering tin usually comes with flux inside it to help you achieve a good solder flow without pre-adding flux. You can't achieve a good solder joint without flux anyway, but it's not always enough for some types of soldering. For example, if you want to reheat certain joints to fix them, or you have overheated the tin and now it has lost its properties, the flux that came out of the strand is already gone. The chances are you'll end up with an even worse looking connection. Also, a mistake is not using flux while trying to remove tin with a desoldering wick. The iron just doesn't want to melt the blob, or there is not enough heat going through the wick. Flux helps transfer the heat faster to the area you need to solder. It makes the joint also look smooth and silky, if you will. I recommend that you get flux paste. It's going to help you immensely to fix your mistakes or to achieve a really good solder joint. This type of flux paste that I have is much more beginner friendly. You can use it in a syringe with a small metal tip that helps you control how much flux you spread and where. You can also get liquid flux and you can use it with a flux pen. This type of flux is not often used, but it does the job and it's easier to clean. Apply flux to any cold joint connection to make it pretty again, fix any solder mistakes you made, or simply add it to help the heat reach all the areas you need to solder and create a smooth, shiny solder joint. You can also add it to your desoldering wick if you see that the blob is being difficult. Also, there are people who use flux and people who abuse flux. Just no. After you're done soldering like this, your solder joints are probably holding together purely out of embarrassment. That's it. This is how the PCB looks after washing. You don't need this much. Yuck. You're gonna spend so much time washing the board over and over again so you can get rid of all of that flux and you just lose time. Just please be mindful of the amount you're using. Moving on to mistake number 5, and that is holding the soldering iron too long in the same spot. Holding the iron on a component for too long can burn the PCB traces or even damage the component itself. It can also overheat the area around small components and then your component flies away. It's the same mistake that we have discussed earlier when it came to choosing the wrong size of the soldering tip. This happens a lot with beginners, but it's part of the learning process. I'm going to mention this here as well, putting too much pressure on the spot you're trying to solder. This leads to damaged components, bent feet, lifted pads, and so on. Aim for about 2 to 3 seconds per joint while applying a light pressure with the soldering iron. And this only comes with practice. You gotta get a feel for it. The key here is to touch both the soldering pad and the middle part of the component at the same time. Then you can introduce the tin to the connection. Keep the soldering iron there just enough for the solder to flow and bond. If it takes too long, you either have to increase the temperature on your soldering iron, or you need to add some flux to help the heat transfer faster. Don't go wild, keep it mild. Mistake number 6 is not prepping your tip before soldering or not cleaning it regularly. A dirty tip leads to poor heat transfer. This will not allow you to transfer heat properly to the areas you want to solder. It can also lead to cold solder joints or the tin not sticking to the soldering pad at all. Keep a damp sponge or brass wool handy to clean your tip every few joints. If you see blackened oxidation forming, re-tin the tip to keep it fresh. You can also get what is called a tip activator, which comes in a small container like this. You dip the tip into it for a second or two, and then see how shiny it becomes. Now your soldering iron is clean and ready to solder. Mistake number 7 is creating cold solder joints. These happen when you don't heat both the component foot and the pad evenly. In this example, I'm only placing the tip of the soldering iron on the ring while also having the wrong shape. It can also happen if the soldering iron is dirty. This is a weak connection and can cause a number of failures with the board. So make sure to heat the pad and the foot at the same time before applying solder. When you place your tip correctly, you will see the pad or the ring around the foot getting shinier when you do it correctly. If that glow is there, then you can be sure you will get a proper flow and a smooth solder joint. Heat it right, keep it tight. Mistake number 8 is using too much or too little solder. Here is where quantity matters. Too much solder can cause short circuits and too little won't hold the connection properly. This can happen because you either choose the wrong size for the soldering tin, there's not enough heat coming from the soldering iron, or simply because you didn't get the hang of this yet. And that's okay. The perfect solder joint should have a concave shape and just enough solder to fully cover the pad and lead. In the case of SMD components, the same principle can be applied, only I prefer to call it the dress. See? It kinda looks like a dress. No? Only me? Okay. Anyway, this is what you're looking for when you're inspecting your work. Good amount of tin, a perfect win. Mistake number 9 is soldering without proper ventilation. Soldering produces fumes that can be harmful if inhaled in large amounts. Always work in a well-ventilated area or with your window open. But what I recommend is using a fume extractor. Meet Ben. I showed Ben in one of my previous videos and he took the spotlight. This is a great fume extractor for the money and it really works. I also recommend that you use lead-free solder. I know people say that the lead one is better, shinier, easy to work with, but at the end of the day, it has lead in it. That's really not good for your health. You decide for yourself, of course, but I had to mention that. And finally, mistake number 10 is positioning the soldering iron wrong. How you position the soldering iron does matter, and here's why. Here I'm holding the iron from above. This is not a correct position. The soldering iron doesn't touch the board and the component well enough, and the heat won't transfer properly to the PCB. We want that in order for the tin to flow easily. Also, it's not a really comfortable position. Here's a better way to do it. Position your soldering iron at a 45-degree angle and wait 1 to 2 seconds for the area to warm up. Then come with the soldering tin almost flat to the board. This is a trick I discovered myself while cursing the tech gods for not allowing me to be in their kingdom. This is, in my opinion, one of the best ways to ensure that everything goes smooth and you get to solder properly. Solder-wise, win the prize.
And that covers the topic of today's video, 10 common mistakes that beginners might make when starting off with soldering. Now you know how to avoid them, now you know what to practice. Be patient with yourself and try to figure out where you're lacking, then practice that again and again and again. One very important thing that you need to remember is that nobody was born an expert. Nobody was born taught these things. This comes with practice, and I encourage you to make mistakes because that's how you learn and get a feel of the craft. Not only do you understand how things work, but you get a sense of how much, when, how little. It's all about these details that you need to practice and integrate in your soldering routines. I will link in the description box down below most of my items that I've used. If you do not see the link, that means I'm either still testing something or I am not really satisfied with it. Either or, I'm not comfortable recommending these products to you. And if you see the link down below, that means I have tested it, I have liked it, or I find it useful when it comes to the soldering process. If you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Also, if you are interested in more of this type of content, make sure to subscribe to my channel. As always, thank you so much for watching. Again, I hope this video was useful and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.